Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to day 310 of Humanity Rising. Over the last couple of days, we've been exploring some issues that have to do with the shadow content of our cultures worldwide as we grapple with rising authoritarianism and we grapple with this extraordinary capacity of human beings for separation and division and cruelty. And I want to raise this today because last Friday, we looked at this recent discovery in Canada of hundreds of mass graves in areas of Canada where Catholic schools were taking care of Indian children that had been abducted from the First Nation tribes there and re-educated. And children as young as 3 years old were killed. And there were mass graves, hundreds and hundreds of mass graves. And this is a phenomenon also in the United States. And it was pointed out that even today, in the state of North and South Dakota, for example, officials are taking young Indian children away from their mothers and putting them in Christian homes for re-education. It's easy to think of this as an aberration, but yesterday, the state of Texas formally petitioned the US Supreme Court to declare unconstitutional the 1978 congressional legislation called the Native Child Welfare Protection Act, so that this practice can legally resume. So we want to take in the importance of mental health, because authoritarianism, racism, sexism, it was the state of Texas just last week that formally, for the first time since Roe v. Wade in the United States 50 years ago, has now abrogated a woman's right to her own body and an abortion. And on the immediate aftermath of that is now going after the right to abduct Indian children for re-education. This is a mental health issue. This is a regressive impulse in the psyche under the stress of contemporary reality that is of acute public concern. And this is one of the reasons why, in addition to sessions on regeneration, and donut economics and how we can proactively regenerate the global ecology, we in Humanity Rising have accentuated public health because in a world of code red, where we're now facing the reality that we are in the climate tipping point, we are now in a situation globally or in the face of rising ecological turbulence, our governments are less and less capable of ensuring any kind of stability that we call normal. And this is why the Secretary General, only a month ago, said that we are now in code red for humanity. And it is the psychological, emotional, and mental equilibrium of all of us personally, as well as collectively, that is going to determine, as we now move into an increasingly turbulent future, whether the human race, countries, cities, families, individuals are going to be able to navigate an increasingly hyper-complex world with reasonable sanity, or whether we're going to deconstruct and give our futures away to coercive authoritarian governments who will be even less capable of dealing with the kinds of challenges that we're going to face than any democracies. So we're at a point of reckoning for the human race. And Humanity Rising, since we started on May 22nd, back in 2020, at the heart of the pandemic, has been endeavoring day by day to bring to you the issues that we all need to think about that we're not getting in the mainstream news. And that's the reason why we're expanding. And we're now going out to tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, even millions of people on our broadcasts, because people need ruthless realism. And we're seeking to bring it to you as best we can in an increasingly conflicted and challenging global environment. So welcome to our program. I know that some of our sessions are tough sessions to take in, but nothing less than a clear-eyed view of reality will suffice in our day to preserve the kind of civilization that we have so laboriously constructed over thousands of years. Everything now is being called into account. And as Carl Jung said, all civilization is the thin veneer that we construct in our psyches to preserve civility in the face of our own atavistic instincts internally, but an ever-changing world externally. So that's our program today. We're launching our first program of our fall on mental health. But before I introduce our moderators, let us pause, as we always do, to just take a moment to center ourselves in our bodies. Take a deep breath, close your eyes. And for the next minute or two, just attune yourself to your heart. See if you can listen to your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. And now, with an open heart and a heart full of gratitude and love for each and every one of you joining our session today, I want to welcome Lars Munter of the Nordic Health 2030 movement and David Somekh of the European Health Futures Forum, who have been so generous and capable over the last number of months in bringing us a series of issues on public health, each time accentuating a different dimension of what it means to engage in public health in a time of COVID and in a time of rising ecological turbulence. So gentlemen, I thank you so much. This is the beginning of 5 sessions that they are going to be choreographing for Humanity Rising, and hopefully some beyond that. But I want to thank you both for everything that you've done to make this issue of public awareness to people all over the world. And I welcome you and turn the program over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I have to say, Lars, I'm sure will echo the sentiment. We've really enjoyed working with you and being involved in this process. So hello, folks. Lars and I are now about to start the 3rd series of webinars, and they've kind of evolved since we began last year. So we began really with, and Lars will go into the detail a bit more, we began with a kind of tasting menu, lots and lots of presenters talking about different aspects of European health. And then we had a 2nd series where we did more of a deep dive. And in a minute, we'll talk about what this 3rd series aims to do. But perhaps, Lars, you'd like to say hello and take it away from me?
Well, I'll add, of course, and though you didn't mean no harm, David, I suppose it's hard to remember actually that it wasn't last year. It was just this year. It's just been a very, very long year for everyone. But
yeah, well, they asked us in November, but you're right.
Yes, indeed they did. But it's worth reminding us all, with that in mind, that it can be hard to remember, no pun intended, David, per se, what we actually did when we started our 1st series and indeed the 2nd series. We've been talking about health in relation to communities, how you build upon communities, engage communities, build strength and resilience via and with communities, and empower people there to take action relating to their own health, be that mental, social, or otherwise. We've looked at design and planning, how that integrates into both our cities in the way that we build our organizations, our workplaces, and so. We've looked at the economy and the interrelation between the economy and the ecology as well, because of course we do not live on a barren planet, well, yet anyway, and there's a great deal about our health that's related to the environment that we're a part of. And then we've looked at digital health, especially how that transformation can be challenging for a lot of people. It bears with it great potential, but also some pitfalls. And that was what we did in the 4th of our sessions. Then we looked at our work life. Well, some of you may remember that back in the day, we actually had workplaces we went to. Nowadays, there can still be a challenge to actually have a work life and to find also a place in your home where you do not have a work life and to find a balance between the two. And we looked further on to health literacy and very much the educational sector. Health and health literacy is not just about ensuring that children can go to school in health and learn. It's also about how after our school years and the rest of our lives, how we build capacities competencies to, well, make the not necessarily right choices, but the choices that matters to us. And then we looked at actually political transformations. A lot of what we do are decided by politicians, as Jim pointed out. Some of it being perhaps more dramatic, more intrusive, but also it might be smaller things. The placement of hospitals and services, the priorities of whether you actually want to build more capacities in communities or want to do more for people with mental disease or more for mental health. And we looked a little bit about the technology again, looked at health tech. Again, like digital health, it has great potential, but also where's the limit? We are not cyborgs yet, nor would we necessarily want to be. But it has certainly a lot of potential to look at how health tech can enable us to do more than we can today. And then finally, sort of both, we actually looked at mental health. We talked about mental health. We talked about the difference between mental health and mental illness. And while we really want to support the mental health, there's definitely also people that are not necessarily just having a little bit of challenges in their stress. They have a disease, and we have to be mindful of the fact that there's people that need help for that too. And then, which would be obvious to a lot of us looking at most societies across the world these days, we've looked at inequalities, both in terms of social status. There's differences in inequalities, gender inequalities, racial inequalities. There's all kinds of inequalities that matters to our health, that influence how we build health, how we plan health, how we do health. So that's the voyage we've been on so far. And now it's with my great pleasure as well that we dive into or voyage forth into our new 5 sessions in the 3rd series. Today, well, I guess you'll introduce the topic, even though it's in the title.
Yes, I think that, thanks, Lars. I think what I do feel, though, I should make a reference to Jim's introduction before we launch into the actual subject, because it gives a context for the work we've been sharing with you. Jim talks about the mental health of society. We might put it just slightly differently. Certainly, with that quote from Carl Jung, he made the point. We're talking about, what do we mean by a healthy society? We don't just mean a disease-free society. And he mentioned the word civility, people treating each other decently and so on. And I think that frames the kind of context that we've approached this turbulent world in terms of looking at health, which is, it's a holistic one. So we are interested in the environment. We started the very first series. It was a little bumpy start, but we actually showed you a video of 2 of our friends and colleagues walking in the woods in Ireland and saying what health meant to them as environmentalists. But now we've come a long way from that, and we're starting to look at some much more detailed work that's going on by experts on how to help to transform the health system within society. And what we're doing in this series, unlike the previous 2, is this is a bit of an experiment for us, is we're having what I call fireside conversations. So instead of 2 or 3 or 4 people coming and making presentation as having a bit of a discussion, we're going to do much more of a conversation with the invited colleagues. Now, as Lars was giving me the opportunity to say, this first one is about co-creation, and we'll get our our colleagues to help us understand what that term means to them and what it might mean to us. And we'll take it from there. So we have two invited guests, and I'll introduce the first one, who is Louise Phillips, who's she's interestingly, she's, as she'll tell you about when I ask her to talk about herself, she's actually from Glasgow originally, but spent, I think, 30 years in Denmark, and is currently head of the research group in the Department of Communication and the Arts on the island of Zealand. And she's particularly interested in dialogic communication, and she'll explain to us how that relates to the process of co-creation. So really, that's all I wanted to say, Louise. It would be really nice to hear from you about where you're coming from and what you do, and how that informs the conversation about co-creation.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you very much, David, for that introduction, and thank you to you all for the opportunity to take part in this event. Some of you will be starting the day different parts of the world, while Lars and I think, are ending the day in Denmark. Here it's in the early evening, and I've just had a long day of teaching. So I hope I'm fresh enough for this conversation. But certainly just listening to you gives me energy. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. I've developed an approach to co-creation together with colleagues in our research group on dialogic communication at Roskilde University here in Denmark. And we work mainly with co-creation in research, that is sort of collaborative, participatory research, where we university researchers do research with people in the practice field under study rather than on or about them. So our research is very often in the field of healthcare. And the research project that I'm currently carrying out at the moment is about Parkinson Dance, which is a special kind of dance which has been developed for people with Parkinson's disease and their spouses. And Parkinson's, as you may know, is an illness which affects you motorically, but also has cognitive and psychological effects and challenges. And our research is together with doing the research together with two colleagues in my research group and a very large group of co-researchers. So we're working with a co-creative approach to research, where instead of doing research on people or about them, we're doing it with them. So the co-researchers in our project are people with Parkinson's disease and their spouses who attend weekly dance classes on Parkinson dance classes. And what we've done in the project is that the co-researchers and we university researchers, we've co-created knowledge through dialogue about Parkinson dance and life with Parkinson's. And this dialogue has taken place in a series of collaborative storytelling workshops where we use creative arts-based research methods to open up for different aesthetic, affective, emotional, embodied ways of knowing about Parkinson dance in the context of people's everyday lives. And I think we know that it's certainly in Denmark, practices based on co-creation have proliferated. So our research group is kept very busy. There's lots to research. There are now policy requirements to engage in co-creation in lots of different areas. So it's become widespread in person and patient-centered care, public and patient involvement in healthcare, in health research, in community building, interdisciplinary and cross-sectoral collaboration, for example, between the primary and secondary health sectors, and so on. And so a key idea, and here's where the transformative power of co-creation lies. This is the idea that if we harness difference as a transformative force, we can create new knowledge and further peaceful existence across differences of professional background and organizational position, where you are in the hierarchy, age, gender, ethnicity, social class, and so on. So this is an ideal of democratizing knowledge production. And when we try to follow this ideal, that means that we work with an expanded understanding of which knowledge and whose knowledge counts. So the idea is that knowledge is democratized as multiple forms of knowledge are recognized as knowledge, in particular experience-based knowledge. So the experiences of people with lived experience of, for example, a chronic illness like Parkinson, their lived experiences are recognized and they're appreciated as forms of expert knowledge. And people with lived experience are recognized as experts. So in co-creation and collaborative research, that means that people with lived experience of the topic are invited to take part as co-researchers in processes of co-creating knowledge, which contributes to the research field, but also co-creating knowledge and transforming practices that can benefit the co-researchers and the communities to which they belong. So, the idea is that the participation of service users as co-researchers and co-creating knowledge that enhances the quality of the insights we produce and their relevance. So the idea is that we can reduce the gap between research and practice, and it can lead to meaningful practice change. For example, in our project, the people with Parkinson's contribute to the project with expert knowledge by virtue of their experiences of dance as part of their everyday life. So this all sounds wonderful. Co-creation is so inclusive and democratic, but unfortunately there's a big but, that it's much more complicated than it sounds in practice. That's the big but. Co-creation has become a buzzword, and its buzzword status means that often the complexity isn't acknowledged. So there's a tendency to romanticize co-creation. So when co-creation operates as a buzzword with a taken for granted positive value, it invokes a kind of promise of smooth, straightforward processes of inclusion among equal partners. And that makes it difficult to raise critical questions. It makes it hard to attend to the complexities of co-creation in practice. You know, it's very hard to question something that's understood as an unconditionally good thing. Right? And the best way to solve, and is understood as the best way to solve problems involving social exclusion and enormous inequalities, including health inequalities. So to finish off, I just want to say that according to our approach in our research group and our research on our different research projects, including the project on Parkinson Dance, the complexities of co-creation involve tensions that arise from power dynamics that are always in play. We can't get rid of the power dynamics. Certain voices will always dominate and set the agenda, and others will be silenced or marginalized or excluded. So the idea, my sort of take on co-creation, is to focus critically and reflexively on the power dynamics that are always in play. So what we do is we carry out critical reflexive analysis of the tensions in the with in research, with, not on people, and the tensions in the in co-creating knowledge. And we integrate these analyses into the research process so that our take on co-creation is at one and the same time constructive and optimistic and supportive, but also critical. So we've got a dual focus on what co-creation can do, its transformative power, and on the challenges that arise from the tensions.
Louise, that's a fantastic start to the conversation. Tell me, this isn't the only kind. I mean, this is your current project that you're particularly involved in.
Yes.
Could you say something about projects that you've successfully completed? What you feel were the key take-homes from those?
Yes. Well, this project that we're completing it now. So we have the feeling that we've arrived at some important results. Also, because my part of the project on Parkinson Dance, or my contribution to it, is to do a kind of ongoing analysis of how power is in play in co-creation in the research process. So I can definitely say a little bit about what I think we've found out there, but I can also mention a previous project which focused on which we carried out together with nurses who advise people with chronic illnesses by telephone. So not digitally, but by telephone. So the nurses help people with chronic illnesses to cope with living with their chronic illness, and they do this with regular telephone calls, which are supportive. And this we worked with the nurses where we carried out analysis of what goes on in the telephone calls, and focused on how the nurses have to kind of negotiate a tension between, on the one hand, creating space for the voices of the patients, and creating a space where they're empowered and feel a sense of agency to cope with their illnesses on the one hand, and then and on the other hand, not just telling them what to do, not imposing their own health-based knowledge, but at the same time wanting, in some ways, it's also important to convey give advice on the basis of professional knowledge, on the basis of health-based professional knowledge, in a way which, in a dialogic way, that's difficult to do. So we focused. So what we did is we worked with the nurses to gain a kind of reflexive understanding of how complex those conversations are. So we gave them tools together. We really developed tools for dealing reflexively with how power is in play in the nurses' conversations. I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Sure. Yeah. It's. I mean, the actual approach you're using is a kind of. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Yeah. No, the approach is a kind of humanistic. If you look at it in the wider sense, it's a kind of humanistic approach to health, isn't it? Where you're seeing the other person as an equal and someone who has feelings like you do. At the same time, as you say, you can't be equal, because after all, they're the ones who've got the major problem, and you're the one with some perhaps slightly more. I mean, we know that people with chronic conditions have got huge expertise on their own condition, but nevertheless, there's this is a good example of co-creation, isn't it, and joint decision making and so on. But by looking at it with the lens of power dynamics, I think the key thing here, isn't it, is helping the professionals behave in a way that they might not have been trained to in their conventional training, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think one of the points that one of the key points of the project was that they gained insight into the tensions between, on the one hand, creating a space for empowering the patient, and on the other hand, actually something that we called self-discipline, that they're also maybe imposing to some extent their own normative understandings, of how patients should behave, that you should lose weight and you should exercise and so on. And that may actually individualize responsibility. So on the one hand, they're creating a space for shared responsibility. On the other hand, they're also maybe pressurizing the patients in a way that lead to a kind of individualization of responsibility, that they should take more care of themselves, a kind of become a kind of self-governing subject who's engaged in self-care. So one of the reflections one of the joint reflections, which I think was important, was that which was how shared responsibility doesn't mean equal responsibility, as you say, since the counselling conversations really position the citizens, the patients, as committed to taking control of their own health as active agents. It kind of puts them in a kind of moral position where they're responsible for taking care of themselves. And the nurses are actually only just involved with their professional identities. So gaining a kind of insight into what shared responsibility means, that it doesn't mean equal responsibility, and we're not equal partners in the conversation.
It's an interesting reflection then, going back to what you were saying about democratization, is what understanding what that means in that complicated relationship, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely, because I think that democratization of knowledge, means that we work with an expanded understanding of which knowledge counts and whose knowledge counts, and it means that knowledge, to some extent, is open to negotiation, because we're recognizing experiential knowledge as legitimate, and we're recognizing people with lived experience of different health conditions as experts. But it doesn't mean that all the different forms of knowledge are treated as equally valid or given equal weight. And I think that's what's very important to have a focus on when we're working with co-creation, is to have a kind of critical understanding that when we democratize knowledge, we're only opening up knowledge to negotiation to a certain extent, and we're doing it in different contexts to different degrees, and different ways of understanding knowledge, open up knowledge to negotiation to varying degrees.
Yeah, I thought you made a very nice point, I think, about labeling too. When you were talking, I was struck by, in the United Kingdom, the health, they're reasonably sophisticated about the concept of patient empowerment. They talk a lot about people with lived experience, but I think the difficulty often is it then just becomes a label, and people don't really treat it properly in actually acknowledging what that means and what the lived experience brings to the table when it comes to the interaction between professionals and the citizen. But look, I'm very grateful. It's a lovely start to the conversation. I wonder, should we at this point, obviously there's lots more we could talk to you about at this stage, but perhaps, Lars, should we now bring our second
Indeed, it's time, and coming into this topic from a slightly different angle. Our next invitee here at the Fireside Chat, Olga Elizarova. And while Louise, as she explained, have been a researcher and researching the power dynamics, researching how to use it, and without sort of suggesting anything in terms of value, Olga has been busy doing it from a design perspective, a building perspective, a developing perspective, and of course learned a few tricks along the way, I'm fairly sure. And certainly also, I would expect a lot about power dynamics as well, which would be no surprise. But please, Olga, Your take on co-creation. Do share, and then also actually as another point, while we are here at the fireside, our dear audience, you are also very welcome to share cases where you've been engaged in co-creative processes, either as Louise shared today, places where there's been research ongoing, or while you listen to Olga, maybe processes with which you try to exercise it yourself in various ways. And we'll try to use that somehow in this fireside chat in a co-creative way. So Olga, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Lars. Thank you, David and Jim, for having me here. Nice to see Louise and all the attendees. In my experience, co-design, from the experience of applying it in the communities and with clients, is the process that I think the best definition that captures it is the process of partnering designers with problem owners to collaboratively facilitate co-creation of solutions that best meet the needs of the problem owners. And the idea is that oftentimes designers can act as subject matter experts, that they know the best the tools, the methods, the activities. In this case, talking about power dynamics, the idea is that designers act as facilitators and problem owners act as subject matter experts. And their subject matter expertise is their lived experience of the things that are oftentimes very hard to empathize with or impossible to empathize with, to truly empathize with. And we're talking about experiences anywhere from what Louise has mentioned as Parkinson disease to things like experiencing homelessness or addiction, or even some other more more healthcare related examples like chronic health conditions, because you can try to imagine what it is like, and you can even, if we're talking about things like diabetes, you can poke yourself in the finger a few times a day and say, oh, I really understand how hard it is. But you know that there is a very definite beginning to your experience and end. With the people who are living this experience day to day, they actually have a very different perspective, and their mindset changes because of this experience, and all the things that they gain is, I think, valuable to bring to design process as a whole, not as just part of their experience. And that's why I think co-design is a great tool to have.
David and I were lucky enough to see a design team in London reimagining how to build health services of various kinds and bringing a design perspective. Some of them without necessarily simplifying design too much. It was amazing to me, at least, maybe that's because I'm Danish, to see how thinking in terms of Lego pieces, you could reimagine both services and hospitals and interactions between people. But of course, that's my cultural background. I see what I know, or I know what I see. But in some of those practices, surely also you recognized also those challenges, as Louise mentioned, the challenges of power dynamics. I mean, even though in theory, people are indeed willing to work together, and it's not as if they don't want to work together, but they can't help not being the same. Of course, there are differences between them. Some of those cases, how do you in your work go around either studying that or trying to work around that challenge in designing something that has to work somehow for, well, not the common good, but at least for a major proportion of that group you're working with?
Sure. overall, the one thing to mention is that, especially for people who may be less familiar with co-design, when you bring it into the process, could contribute to any part of your solution design or research or ideation or anything. So if you are familiar, let's say, with design thinking process, where we start with the research and we go to ideation, prototyping, and testing, co-design could be part of every step. And when we're thinking about the value that it could bring, it brings value during each of the steps and stages, but different type of value. And depending on when we are involving people in the process, depending on when we are involving people in the co-design, the power dynamics would be very different. So, for example, in some of the projects that I worked on, we worked with doctors and patients and different health administrators and stuff all in the same room. And we knew in advance that there would be some power dynamic where patients would not be feeling comfortable to say certain things, where they would feel like they would, you would expect that the doctors would be a more prominent voice in the group or some more authoritative voices. And to address that, the activities that we designed during that stage, which was the ideation and brainstorming, were actually actively trying to enable people to switch the roles. So they were providing a choice to people to switch the roles, and doctors, for example, they could take the role in the role play activities of patients, and patients, they could take the roles of doctors. And when they were actually trying to describe their patient experience, doctors were trying to describe their patient experience, or they heard patients acting as doctors, even though it was just a role playing activity. That was just one of many ways you probably could do that in the introduction to the workshop, instead of proactively announcing the titles and the things that could make people feel uncomfortable or incompetent to share their perspective. We actually ask them to share their values, and we ask them to share their superpowers, something that would be more likely to be sort of equally distributed, and something that would create this more comfort and trust and sharing, comfortable sharing among the group. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to a certain extent, as much as possible, to predict if there would be this power dynamic in the group, and try to make sure if we have any ways to mitigate this. And then, of course, there's also opportunities when you know that this would be the case to design separate co-design workshops. There was one when we were working with youth and mentors, and by the end of this workshop, we actually thought that when we do this next time, it will actually be better to do a separate co-creation workshop with mentors and separate co-creation, co-design workshop with youth. So there are ways to apply strategies to try to mitigate this power dynamic throughout the workshop, especially if you know that might be likely to happen, or try to restructure the workshop itself, I think, or the activities that you are doing.
That actually then, I guess, sort of leads beautifully into a question from our audience to the both of you, I suppose, Olga and Louise, about surprises. At least surprises might be different than realizations. But the question from the audience is a surprise that you've had during one of these interactions that has really led you to perhaps a realization about how to build things differently or to construct things differently. You can answer, well, either one of you, but I'd love to actually hear from both of you what your surprises might have been.
Yeah, and maybe should I go first? Is that okay,
yes,
Olga?
Please, Louise.
Yeah. I think it's a really good question, because I think that one of one of the things that I focus on in my research, is actually discomfort. It's when I feel uncomfortable when something occurs, because this kind of feeling of discomfort alerts you to something funny is going on, something's not working right, I think that because I know how complicated co-creation is, I think I'm not surprised when things start to go wrong. Maybe I get surprised when things start to go right. So I think I remember the last kind of moment of surprise that I can remember was in our Parkinson project, where we had a meeting in our steering group, which contained members of consisted of co-researchers and dance instructors, and was actually part of where they contributed to the co-design of our workshops. And this was quite a tense meeting in which some of the co-researchers reacted to what they saw as our domination, the researchers' way of dominating the meeting and not opening up enough to the voices of the participants, and not taking into account enough their needs and their wishes in relation to the process. So when we were this meeting was just before our symposium, where we brought together a group of co-researchers and dancers and dance instructors to find out to really engage in kind of mutual learning about Parkinson dance through dance. And this is where the surprise that's coming now, which is that when we dance together, so the idea is we weren't just co-creating knowledge about dance, but we were doing it through dance, in dance. And then we all felt a sort of visceral, feelings of joy and social connectedness as we danced together, which provided a kind of seedbed, a basis, a very solid platform for mutual learning, for kind of collaborative, dialogic, embodied learning, which shows really the importance and the value of that what happens, connectedness, the social connectedness when you dance together, which is maybe preempting the discussion we may have later on what happens when we engage in digital co-creation, where we don't have the same kind of basis for embodied social connectedness. So that was maybe a bit of a spacey example, but it was something that everybody felt, and we all came away from the symposium elated and actually feeling that we had learned a lot from each other through dance.
It's a great example.
Yeah. And for once, not an out-of-body experience, but in
yeah.
yeah. Yes, Olga, maybe also.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Louise, there's always some kind of surprises during co-creation and co-design sessions, but one of them is when you're including people in the process early on, kind of more focused on research insights and identifying how to leverage co-design to better understand the needs and better understand the problem itself. And it's always surprising how much people are comfortable sharing and how much more you can build the problem map, the understanding of what's not working or what's the need, what's the perspective, when you actually are using different kind of tools. And when you're doing the regular research and people know that you just want answers from them, they provide exactly what you ask them for. When you're including them differently and you actually value their expertise and you continuously remind them about that they are the experts and you really want them to help you throughout the process, like they bring their whole self there, and you see so much more engagement, so much more insights. And then later down the road, I think it's always surprising to see how interesting are some of the ideas of the solutions that people come up with. So you just read through some of the prototype ideas, or when people present it to you, and because they have this lived experience, you know, there was a quote that was saying that people directly affected by the problem are oftentimes the best equipped to solve it. So you see that they are indeed the best equipped to solve it. Maybe they don't have the right tools to build it. Maybe they don't have exactly the language to describe it, but you see that there's so much value and so much potential in the ideas that they bring.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting how much, as you describe, the value of true co-creation as opposed to 90% or so. But then also perhaps as Louise, you touched upon it quite early on. One of the challenges to co-creation is, of course, when it's not done right, when it's a tick box instead of a true exercise. And I'm sure that you'll agree, David, also that's something we're very curious about. I mean, we definitely would like to see more co-creation, but it has to be the right one. You can't apply it a little bit. You might be doing more damage than good. Right, David?
Can I make a point here? It's about I don't know whether that's in response to what you just said, Lars. It's a bit like co-creation from the heart. You know, I mean, I was trying to ask Olga a question. I'm not diverting, I hope, from what you were saying, Lars, but I know that you worked, Olga, in a very respected consultancy, design consultancy, before you branched out on your own. And since you have, you decided to do work particularly with disadvantaged communities. I just wonder if you could tell us a tiny bit about what motivated you, kind of how you went down that particular track.
Yeah, sure. So right now, as you mentioned, I work primarily with underserved communities, with nonprofits, with social impact, social enterprises, organizations, basically organizations that could really benefit from design approaches, co-design, but oftentimes don't have money to pay for the regular consulting services. And the reason is twofold. One is that I see that most of these organizations, they actually experience lack of the services. So you have the need. You see that they are having the same issues, the same challenges that oftentimes the corporations would hire us to solve. You know, and you would be solving the problem of missed appointments or missed appointments for some very respectable hospital that is owned by some corporation, or you have the same challenge but experienced by federally qualified health center, where they just don't have money to hire consultants to help them implement some of the strategies or techniques, or to actually help them understand why this is happening, and to not, what I think is really important, to help them to not build solutions that actually don't match the problems. Because oftentimes one of the outcomes of this engagements with them was that they'll be like, oh yeah, but we really want to buy this system to, you know, implement it, like very expensive solution that is actually not reflecting the needs of the people. And you're like, can we do research? Can we please take 2 days or 3 days to do research so you can actually, you know, understand that that might not be the best solution to the problem? And that's all, right? It could be co-design, it could be just like 1 or 2 days, it could be a co-creation session, something, so they can hear from the users, so they can hear from people experiencing this challenge that is not what's going to fix it. And oftentimes they don't have opportunity to hire someone to do this. And then in general, I thought that the process that most of consulting companies and agencies have as it is set up is not very friendly for a co-design process, because you would have a process, a contract that would be written that would set up all the details to say we interview 10 people, then we design in the room on our own, then we show them what we designed, and then we deliver. And that is the limitation, that is the restriction. You're like, okay, but can we actually involve people throughout? If you involve people throughout, then, you know, it might affect the timeline. We might need to think about different kind of incentives, because we want to provide incentives for people for their time and for their input. So I think that the process is very different, and now you can actually do both. I can choose the organizations, the communities, and people who I actually truly believe would benefit from this, and I want to help. And also at the same time, if there is a limitations, if there's a certain process that needs to happen, I can actually advise on what's the best way to do this, and not have to follow this process of only bringing people in the beginning and only in the end, and then to the extent instrumentalizing their experiences to just fit in whatever you already wanted to do, you know, just validating, oh yeah, they said that they want to do this, good. You hear what you want to hear, and then you go on and you do your thing. But like, that's not it's gonna be a very expensive mistake down the road for you as well. So
well, you're giving a good example of not ticking the box there, aren't you?
Indeed, but I suppose also a challenge then is that what you see is you get the answer that you want to hear, because you actually want to maintain control, I suppose. So how do you deal with that? I mean, obviously loss in a way of control, a gain of quality, yes, a gain of insights, but a loss of control. Instead of just flipping to page 4 and get the answer, you have to actually ask people. How do you deal with that sometimes with either the medical professionals or the stakeholders that design the process or write the contract that if you will, you think is wrong, Olga, or that is obviously wrong? How do you go this step before to deal with that?
I mean, I think that one of the best ways, if you can catch it early, kind of similar to the whole public health idea of prevention is better than treatment. You're trying to catch it early on. You're trying to catch it at the stage where you're conversing with people and they're telling you about their great solution. And you are saying, okay, but have you actually involved people in the process in any way? Not just by talking to them and asking their opinion about your idea, but actually doing the different kind of research, different kind of interactions with them. And I think that definitely would be number one strategy of trying to catch it as early as possible and show people a very clear value of doing it this way versus a traditional way. And many of these organizations who have this pre-defined, predetermined ideas of what the right solution is, actually, if they would be very self-aware and they would look at all the results, if that is part of the outcomes that they measure that happened. I mean, many of them have cemeteries of digital apps. They have so many things that they know themselves didn't work. And all you need to do is you need to just be very honest with yourself. You're like, okay, why would you continue doing the same thing that hasn't worked and expect different outcomes? Try something different and then see if that in fact would lead to a different kind of outcome. So catch it early if you can prevent
Catch it early,
from
yes.
happening.
Yeah, certainly a good
Louise,
idea. Sorry, you go ahead, David. I can wait.
Yeah, Lars. Louise, I was going to ask you it's a very different context, but what Olga's raising is something. It's certainly in design. I know we've done work with people about early user involvement in health tech design. Exactly the same. It's about breaking the mold of the traditional thing of handing down the tablets to people rather than asking them what they need and so on. But I'm very interested, Louise, about what's the equivalent of that in the academic world. I mean, presumably you also have your code, if you like, and I mean, in taking up research, you must be vetting it in your mind about whether that fits to the way you think things should be done and so on.
Oh, definitely, because my way of doing research is based really on a normative position, which is that I think that we can generate more new knowledge which is relevant and meaningful for the participants if we co-create with them rather than just creating knowledge about them. And it's when you work in this way, you become embroiled in a kind of political struggle for legitimacy, because despite the lip service given in policy at policy level to co-creation, and despite the increasing traction of the ideal of democratizing knowledge, in the way of working when you work with co-creation and research is not a way which is widely recognized. It's low down in the academic hierarchy, if you like. I mean, there's still traditional understandings of what knowledge is, and traditional understandings of validity dominate. So this idea of control, to really go back to what Lars was talking about, where does it come from that there are so many projects on co-creation which involve ticking the box? And I think if we've got to look at the political context, the political, socio-political conjuncture that we're living in order to get a kind of answer to that, I think that there's a technocratic way of doing co-creation, a technocratic model, where the focus is on the outcome. You're providing the you're providing people with particular results. You're creating social and technological innovation and growth in the knowledge economy. And what happens here often is co-creation gets instrumentalized as a means to solve predefined problems and obtain results furthering preset outcomes of innovation and goal and growth. So this is where you get the kind of tick box kind of co-creation. We've involved all these people and we've produced these outcomes, but what happens is it's a kind of narrow technocratic co-option. And what happens is that people's personal experiences get reduced to a kind of supplement to individual consumer choice. So rather than really radically destabilizing the knowledge hierarchies and opening up for experience-based knowledge, you involve new people, which is co-researchers, in really doing the same kind of processes, and you produce outcomes that are easy to measure, but the focus is really on realizing predefined outcomes rather than the very open-ended process which co-creation is when you relinquish control. Because co-creation involves co-creation when you work in a democratic way involves the relinquishment of control, where you actually don't know what the outcome's going to be. And as Olga's talking about, it's a huge leap of faith for collaborative partners to accept that, well, what you're going to end up with, we don't actually know. And unfortunately, in both academia and in the policy world, often the results of these processes are measured on the basis of sort of traditional criteria of validity. So they expect you to be able to control your data and control your subjects and so on. And therefore, co-creation, research based on co-creation is often not really fully recognized as real research.
Certainly the framework you present, it makes the use of the word innovation rather laughable, doesn't it?
Well, there's research that shows, there's quite a lot of research that shows that a lot of the so-called, co-creative work designed to produce social and technological innovation actually just reproduces, existing processes, but with new participants. And that means when you involve people with experience-based knowledge, it becomes tokenistic. You get a kind of tokenistic add-on where they're involved in existing processes to really just reproduce the knowledge we had in the first place, rather than to radically destabilize knowledge hierarchies and create transformative knowledge.
Lars.
Well,
I interrupted you way back.
yeah, but that is, of course, one way of also producing déjà vus, I suppose. It reminds me of something, but what is it? Yes, my past. No. Well, what I was going to ask you before was actually related to going back to the before, because in a lot of those instances you're talking about, the people that are trying to innovate or trying to co-create, they're caught in their own concepts sometimes. So thinking of healthcare professionals, since we're talking about health in this, but it can apply to other professions, of course. But do we also need to train healthcare professionals differently? Do they in fact have the tools per se to really be the coaches, the co-producers, the shared decision makers that, well, they aspire to be? Some of them. David's a doctor, so I can tease him from time to time. But should we also redesign or rethink the way that we train these people so that they actually, well, get a fighting chance to at least over time learn new traits?
I just say something very, very brief about that. I think that I think the short answer is yes. I think we do need new ways of. I don't want to really use the word training because I think it should be a co-creative process, a collaborative process. I think it's very important when we think about education of health professionals that we engage in mutual learning and collaborative learning, taking into account all the time, what makes sense for them in their own daily practices. So I think my short answer would be, I think that in all modesty, because this is what we're doing in our research group, we work with very close partnerships, very close collaborative relationships with health professionals and health boards in order to engage in mutual learning, in order to learn from each other, so that so that the focus is on gaining, and I think to a large extent it's about creating reflexive practitioners. So working with healthcare professionals to recognise how their role in shaping social realities through their interaction with patients. You know, how what they say shapes the responses of the patients, of the people, of the healthcare users, and how they're together working to through kind of joint action to co-create realities, so that if we talk in different ways, then we can open up for different ways of understanding the world and learn from each other. So maybe the short answer to that is yes, but a collaborative dialogic approach based on principles of mutual learning.
But also, Louise, you talked about the learning from dancing with your clients. What it made me think of when Lars asked that question is there's a very, very respected professor of primary care in a university in Belgium, in Ghent, and he tells us about how he takes medical students from the hospital and takes them to deprived housing to meet people in their own kitchens. And it's about starting them young, just getting people to recognize that they're dealing with real people rather than patients in a hospital. And I think that's a very important start to that whole process of humanizing the approach, isn't it? I think
definitely, yeah. I would just want to mention that in our research project, we're actually producing a co-created graphic novel that actually narrative medicine and graphic medicine are fields of medicine that have been developed in order to sensitize health professionals to the perspectives and the lived experiences of patients, of people. And in our project, we've actually co-created a graphic novel which anchors people, the knowledge that we've co-created in the workshops in people's everyday lives through graphic representation of what Parkinson Dance means to them as part of living a meaningful life with Parkinson's. I couldn't help mentioning that.
No, but I guess it's also a good point. In the chat, we've written a little bit about Legos, and it's not. I'm not trying to. I'm not supported by the company, but the point here is, of course, again, that creative processes, whether that be dancing or writing, drawing, can be an open space to do some of these processes. And reminds me actually also, David, I can't remember the last time we went dancing.
No, I can't dance.
No. All I remember is actually watching Riverdance with you at one point, and I'm not sure neither one of us would be good at that. But it is worth remembering that these processes, these creative processes, that's actually, interestingly enough, they're not necessarily taught very much in our schools. And been either whether we're talking about music or creativity in other ways, not necessarily prioritized very much, but they're essential to these co-creative processes or can be often a gateway to do that. So that's a very good thing to remember. Sorry, Olga?
Could I add something
Please,
to
Olga,
the previous question?
Absolutely.
Also, as I was previously a doctor, when I switched from clinical practice to public health, I was thinking that, wow, public health is great. I didn't even know any of this when I was working in the clinic. This is great knowledge, very useful perspective, all the things. Then I switched from public health to design, and I was like, oh my God, how did I do what I was doing without knowing this? And as you're working in design, especially the projects that I worked on, many of them were about innovation in healthcare. all the all the great upcoming things and stuff, and the innovation that I actually have seen in the clinical practice. I think that the short answer to the question, do doctors need new knowledge, is yes, to stay relevant like everyone else. Like, you think that some professions are immune and they always will be there and you can continue to just do what you did, but everything from just the context that keeps changing about what is the role of the doctor and what should they do, and that is impacted and influenced by the types of patients that they see, the diseases that they see. The diseases have changed in the last 20 years. It was a huge shift in the top 10 diseases that cause mortality. Like you started the conversation with the mental health. There's a huge aspect of co-creation and co-design. We are trying to help patients with mental health diseases, especially with severe mental health diseases. Otherwise, it's not going to be a successful outcome. You have to problem solve. You have to find a way to make it work, and tailored interventions too. And outside of that, there is all the advancements about how doctors do and deliver diagnosis and treatments, and what do they use. So as that changes, I think that they have to learn new skills. And I think that design skills, co-design skills, getting to learn how to involve patients, how to involve people in the ecosystem, not just patients, family members, other people, how to involve them meaningfully and co-create this value, that would help improve the health outcomes. Because otherwise, you're just not catching up with the ever-changing context of the health systems, disease that are changing, patients that are changing, the patient's lifestyle that is changing, all the things. So I think you have to.
Olga, you've opened up a huge area, and I'm looking at the clock, unfortunately. But I mean, this is you're defining why we're taking the theme of transformation, because what you also know, and many of us here, is the resistance to change of the professions wanting to do what they always did, just like the designers you described doing the same, and yet it doesn't make sense. And you have to think how to help them, or to be, at least to walk the talk, and hope that people will pay attention to it. One of the things that I was going to ask you was, there's a risk for Lars and me, and talking to Louise as well, that we're a bit Eurocentric. And I just wondered, do you feel that there are, we know the context in the States is very different, the health context. You don't have universal health care. There are all kinds of pressures and divisions in society. But do you still think that the basic approach is the same, or does it have to be different somehow across the pond?
I think it should be the same. I think that if anything, it should be even more patient-centered, more involving all the different kind of stakeholders, because of how not very well organized the system is. So if you have a system that is to the extent working for someone, for some groups of people, then some groups of people can navigate it, etc. But in my opinion here, it's one of the most hard to navigate systems, even for people who you think should be able to do this, even for people who have all the so-called skills and tools and resources and all the things. Like, it's hard because of how broken the system is. And I think because of that, it should be the same or even more patient-centered, focused on co-design, co-creation, because all the people should be involved in trying to patch it from different places. I don't know, rebuild it from the ground up.
Well,
Last words, Lars?
Well, for me, talking about co-creation today, it was also sort of an analogy to talk about, well, democracy. using a tool to reshape, to redefine something that's about respect, about dignity, about involvement, and ultimately using that for a transformation. Every huge journey starts with a small step, and this is one of those small steps, I suppose. So even though we talked about co-creation, we also talked about the reclaiming of our societies into a democratic and truly something that's for humans, with humans, and not actually built for greed or for other purposes, strife for that matter. So I think the last word, if any, is yours, David, and then we have to turn it over to our friendly host, Jim, for the final word.
Yeah, we really want to turn it over, but I have to say in the meantime, look, thank you, Louise and Olga, so much for your time and for sharing your passion about what you do. Like all good conversations, I think we want to go on talking, but the clock says otherwise, and we have to respect the boundary for Jim to hand over to Jim now for the connection with the next sessions. But thank you very much indeed, and we've enjoyed it very much. Jim.
Thank you, David, Lars, Louise, and Olga. This has been fascinating. And just a couple quick comments on my part. I mean, I've been simultaneously depressed and inspired. Your last point, Olga, that, we're dealing with a broken system that needs to be rebuilt from the ground up at a moment when public health is becoming acutely important. So the suggestions that you're making are, I think, very, very timely. And I would just, to use a metaphor around dance, I think right now, public health to a large extent is controlled by, a scientific reductionist understanding of the world, and therefore predominantly is comprised of big pharma. And I think Joy Gilfillan just put something in the chat box that I think is really important. We need to shift our understanding of public health to public vitality. Just imagine public health oriented toward dance as opposed to pills. That shift of paradigm would radically transform how people feel about themselves in relationship to how they build their health. So I think there's been the seeds in this conversation of many of the impulses that are right now around the surface, underneath the surface, that if they were given full expression, as you pointed out, Lars, this is ultimately about democracy. This is ultimately about the people coming together in a way that empowers them metaphorically to dance, because we know from research all over the world that our immune systems are built by nutrition, by exercise, and most fundamentally by a sense of loving relationships with people around us in community. And that's the public vitality that keeps us strong. I saw a study just the other day from the University of California, Santa Barbara, showing that if you're an advanced meditator, you're building up the immune response that can withstand COVID. And you're just meditating. So when we think of public health and we think of mental health, we're really thinking about how we shift the whole culture into the dance. And that's not the complete answer, but I just think it's a great metaphor for all of us to contemplate as we think about what we need to do now that we're facing globally escalating and increasingly lethal ecological turbulence. So again, everyone, these sessions on public health that Lars and David are putting together are not just of academic interest. In my view, they are critical components to how humanity needs to think about navigating into the future, because what we're experiencing now is only going to become more acute as the months and years roll by. So the issue of public health is important. So thank you all. This has been a splendid session, and I look forward to your next one, Lars and David, down the road. But Olga, Louise, you've been fabulous, and I really thank you, and thank you all for the wonderful comments in the chat. And you're all welcome to join our after session chat. They'll put the link in the box. Shannon just did that. So if any of our presenters can spend a few more minutes, that would be great. And then also, I just wanted to say that tomorrow, we're going to go into a completely different domain. We're going to talk with a doctor, Todd Ovokadis, trained at Johns Hopkins University and taught as a professor at Georgetown University's medical school. He's been probing the barriers to aging and looking at the technology that will allow human beings now to start breaking through the boundaries of death. You know, in the Bible, it says that God ordained that human beings could only live to be 120 years. What if we could redesign it so that we could live indefinitely into the future? Well, Dr. Ovokadis is very close to cracking that code. So join us here again tomorrow on Humanity Rising, same time, same station, for our next installment. Thank you, everyone. Again, Lars, David, Louise, Olga, fabulous, very inspiring. Bye for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.